This is not a sponsored video. A few weeks ago, I was taking some photos. Not these particular ones, but this is a story, just hang with me for a second here. But my friend remarked at how he never sees me without the camera I was using, and that was kinda cool. It was somewhat eye-opening for me because it wasn't a conscious thing. I didn't one day decide, hey, this was gonna be the camera that I would take with me every day no matter where I was going. Whether it was a vacation, a work trip, a trip to the grocery store, this camera always found its way into my hoodies, coats, or just around my wrist. Wrist strap gang, by the way. You saw the title. You already know what the mystery camera is. It's the FujiFilm x100F. Man, imagine I randomly said it was some other camera. Hey, what's up? How's your dog doing? The FujiFilm x100F is what we're going to be talking about today. It's a premium compact digital camera from Fujifilm's X series. It came out in February of 2017 and it's the 4th generation of the X100 series cameras. You might be saying to yourself, but Lou, there's a new model out, the X100V. Well, I think it's the perfect time to look at the F because it's cheaper now. I've had this camera for almost 3 years and I've used it as my daily carry for about the last year. So as you might expect, I have some opinions on it. There are some things I love about this camera, and there are also some things I don't love so much, but you're gonna hear all about my experience, the photo, the video, the ease of use, the ergonomics, all that fun stuff. 2 quick notes before we get into things. First off, Fuji didn't send me this camera. I bought it with my own money from some sketchy dude on Craigslist. So yeah, one day if I randomly stop uploading, I think you know why. It's because my Craigslist dealings caught up with me. And second, I actually chose to work on this video sooner because of this YouTube poll I did, so thanks for voting in that. Keep an eye out for those in the future because you can help decide what's happening next on the channel. Alright guys, let's talk photos. So what can I say about the photos you can make with the X100F? I don't know, but they're pretty great. To me, there's a mindset when you're using this camera. I've seen people call this a beast for street photography. I've seen people say it's a poor man's Leica. There's truth to those titles, but honestly to me, this camera is a jack of all trades. It can do a lot of things. And I say that fully acknowledging the fact that being a jack of all trades tends to come with the master of none title as well. The X100F isn't perfect, but there's no such thing as a perfect camera in my opinion. So why the X100F? Well, it does have some quirks that frankly annoy me. It's really hard for me to knock a camera that's been with me through so much. A camera that hasn't let me down, a camera that's super reliable and works in all sorts of scenarios, and most importantly, a camera that's preserved so many incredibly important moments in my life. Weddings, birthdays, moving. This camera really knows how to get out of the way of itself and just let the user make photos. The X100F is pure simplicity. You don't have to worry about lenses or adapters or anything like that. It's just a self-contained absolute unit. As someone who owns Canon and Sony crap, whenever I shoot a wedding or take a trip or whatever, it's a scramble to say, oh my god, do I have this charger? Do I have this lens adapter? None of that happens with the X100F. I can leave the house with this camera and nothing else, and I'll be ready to create. Furthermore, the 35mm equivalent focal length is pretty close to what our eyes see, which makes this a unique tool to just point and shoot. Those of you who have been around here for a while know that I really value that. I love my point and shoot cameras. Rest in peace, my Fuji GA645Zi. But this camera is so much more than an expensive, fancy-looking point and shoot. Of course, you get full-on manual control, but more importantly, you get a user experience that is just brilliant in my opinion. More on that later. A single-lensed, fixed focal length, small beam premium compact camera is not gonna do it for everyone. Man, that was a mouthful. But for me, there's something about this camera that just works. And I don't just say that in the ironic, douchey kind of Todd Howard sense.
All of this just works. It's not, I'm not kidding.
I mean, no matter what the scenario has been, I've never been disappointed in bringing the X100F with me. While this isn't at all a video camera, I'm gonna talk about the video mode for a brief second. Here's the nutshell. It's clunky. It's not ideal for video, but it's nice to have in a pinch. And before you comment, I want to be clear about that. I fully understand that this is not a video camera. Getting into the video mode is mildly inconvenient. There's no dedicated button or mode dial, so you have to press drive and go through the drive menu to switch over. And hey, I know, it's not the biggest deal in the world to do this, but it's annoying to do it every time. Feels like I'm putting in some GTA wanted level code like R1, R1 circle, R2, up, down, up, down, up, down, up, down. That's from Vice City, and if you think I just looked that up, you're absolutely wrong. That is just burned into my memory. The video works, but it's nothing to write home about. If you're walking around and randomly happen to see Matthew McConaughey robbing a Taco Bell, he'll probably be on his way with all the money in Baja Blast by the time you switch from photo to video mode on this camera. But still, you're getting 1080p, you're getting 60 frames per second, you're getting good colors, and you're getting the FujiFilm simulations. It's everything you'd expect from a modern Fuji camera, but it's just not really in the right form factor in my opinion. I need a deeper grip to go handheld. Because of the form factor, it's tricky to keep the camera steady in video mode. I find that the footage tends to look somewhat jittery if you're not using some sort of stabilizer or tripod. The continuous autofocus is decent, but the camera does hunt around quite a bit, especially in low light, and the focus motor is a little bit loud. And since you're on a fly-by-wire focusing system, you can kind of forget manual focusing in video mode unless you're on sticks, otherwise it's gonna look something like this. Woof. Still, there have been times where I've captured video on the x100F, and I was glad to have it with me. After all, the best camera you have is the one you have on you. I know almost 7 minutes into the video is a weird time to give you some context, but I want to give you some quick context before I talk about the ease of use and ergonomics. I've only used this camera in the X100 series, so never used the older ones, haven't used the new one, just this one. In my experience on YouTube, for some reason there's a portion of the Fuji fan base that will just say no matter what, the older version is better and cheaper and blah blah blah, especially the X Pro 3 review. Man, that camera was more divisive than the Marauder from Doom Eternal. Just kidding, there's no argument there. If you hate the Marauder, you're just incorrect. Do me a favor and unsubscribe. But believe it or not, this section isn't about Doom Eternal, it's actually about ease of use and ergonomics, and I'm happy to report they're good. The X100F feels wonderful in the hands. It's a nice little slab of metal. It feels sturdy, it feels very premium. I think it is important to note, especially for those already in the Fujifilm ecosystem, that this camera packs the same internals as the X-T2 and the X Pro 2, so you get that sort of power in a much smaller body. You're working with a 24.3 megapixel APS-C X-Trans CMOS 3 sensor. Man, say that one 3 times fast, but in all seriousness, you are getting like a mini X Pro 2, which is kinda cool. It's small, but not too small. Before I had the X100F, I actually used the X70, which looking at it now and comparing, the X70 feels way too small. Though I will say the X70 had a good grip, it felt pretty good in the hands. But now that I got my big meaty claws around the X100F, I feel as though I can't go back. The camera is compact enough to make it comfortable to travel with, but don't get it confused either. This isn't the most pocketable camera ever. Maybe like a coat pocket or a hoodie, but putting this in your jeans is just not very comfortable. If you haven't already noticed, the camera is covered in dials and switches and buttons and clicky doodads that make the camera just a blast to use. And I know that sounded sarcastic, but it wasn't. I think I just have a problem and I'm by default sarcastic. Instead of having a mode dial, you actually use the individual aperture, shutter speed, and ISO dials to change your settings. So it's a really simple system. If you want to be in control of everything, full manual, you just adjust everything. If you want to be in program mode, you just put everything to auto. Aperture priority, you set the aperture to whatever value you want, and you just leave the ISO and the shutter speed to auto. Alongside that, you also have an excellent clicky exposure compensation dial, and I gotta tell you, ever since getting on this camera, I really fell in love with aperture priority mode. I would just set my aperture and use the exposure compensation dial. It's just a great way to focus on your composition. The exposure compensation dial goes up to plus or minus 3 stops, and if you switch over to custom, you can go all the way up to 5. The ISO dial can be a little fiddly. I'm so used to it now that it doesn't really faze me anymore. It works just like the dials on a film camera would. You lift the collar up, you turn it to set the ISO, and then you let it go. This design, of course, is improved in the X100V, where you just lift the collar and it actually locks in place. You can also program ISO onto the dials on the front or back of the camera, but honestly, to me, it kind of defeats the purpose. I feel like most people who gravitate towards cameras like this are getting it because of that tactile film-like experience. In terms of looks, the X100F is gorgeous in my opinion. It's sleek and stylish and nostalgic, and it's premium. It looks like a nice camera. It looks great on the shelf even. In retrospect though, I almost wish I would have went for the black version of the camera. While I love the classic black and silver finish, it's just kind of loud. It calls attention to itself. I can't count how many times I shot on this camera and had people come up to me asking if I was shooting on a film camera. Which, if you're trying to Assassin's Creed style blend in and do your thing, that might be a slight problem for you. The X100F uses a leaf shutter system, meaning you get those crazy high flash sync speeds, and you can shoot all the way up to 1/32,000th of a second in electronic shutter mode, which is
quite fast.
Can't say I've ever really used it myself, but it is there. The camera has a built-in ND filter, which coming from Canon DSLRs is wild to me. I'm so used to carrying around screw-on filters that having one built into the camera is cool and very useful. Haha, Coheed and Cambria number. But here's something kinda lame. It doesn't work in video mode. It's kinda like how Nintendo only lets you have one Animal Crossing island per Switch. Granted, I don't really use the camera for video, but if I did, having an ND filter built in would be nice. You can actually use filters on this camera too if you unscrew this front piece. The filter thread is 49mm. I actually stumbled upon this article mentioning the fact that if you use filters, you should use the included adapter piece. Now my sketchy Craigslist deal actually didn't include this piece, but according to this article, if you're rocking a filter on the lens without the adapter, you'll limit the extension of your lens and your camera will try to brute force past it, potentially blowing out the lens motor. That said, I don't really mess with filters on this camera, so I don't know. Anyway, since we're in the neighborhood, let's pop in and say what ups to the lens. The lens is pretty impressive in my opinion. Sharpness is pretty wild in the center. It gets a little fuzzy in the corners, but not the end of the world. It is particularly sharp when it's stopped down. Wow, Lou, stopping down your lens makes it sharper, you don't say. The lens is a 23mm Fujinon f2 lens that's a 35mm equivalent on full frame. Again, this is an APS-C size sensor. It really only shows a significant amount of softness when shooting up very close. We're talking like almost macro territory. When the lens is wide open and up close to a subject, it gets very mushy. There's almost like a hazy look to it. Stopping down the lens a bit to f4 or f5.6 will clean that up significantly. But according to some people in the forums, there is a bit of a lens softening effect that goes on when you're shooting wide open. Apparently it's for portraits, but I couldn't find official documentation saying that, so take that with a grain of salt. I don't really know. The viewfinder is satisfactory. I don't want to rave about it because I've certainly used much better. I tend to mainly use the electronic viewfinder over the optical viewfinder though. The optical viewfinder has frame lines since the viewfinder window is just that, it's not looking through the lens. I found my compositions never quite come out the way I envisioned them through the optical viewfinder. Not sure if the frame lines aren't 100% accurate or if I'm an egg, which is entirely possible. I prefer the electronic viewfinder anyway, as it shows you your settings in real time, even if the colors aren't super accurate, and by today's standards it's not the best electronic viewfinder. It still does its job, it's good enough. You can toggle between the EVF and the OVF by playing with this little dick over here. The X100F also has a joystick that allows you to select your autofocus points. I actually didn't know that this was a new feature in the series, but man, I love it. I talked about how much I loved and needed that on the 5D Mark III. It's just such a welcome part of this camera. Honestly, I couldn't imagine the X100F without it. And in my experience, the autofocus is pretty damn good. When using the single shot autofocus, I rarely get shots that are out of focus, but if I'm using the continuous autofocus, that's where things get a little bit iffier, especially in video mode. It tends to be a little bit hesitant and not really sure where to focus. The camera also has a digital teleconverter which allows you to choose between 3 different focal lengths, the default 35mm, a 50mm, and a 70mm. It comes with 2 drawbacks. First off, you can't shoot RAW in this mode, which if you're about that film life, that's not the biggest of deals to you. But second, and more importantly, the image quality drops in this mode, presumably because it's just cropping in on the image. Fuji also makes physical converters that you can screw onto the lens in order to change the focal length. Sounds cool, but I don't have them, so I got nothing. Moving on, let's talk about the film simulations. Now, I was a skeptic about these, I'm not gonna lie, but ever since Fuji let me test out the X Pro 3 and the X-T30, I'm a believer. Fuji's film simulations are pretty damn awesome. A lot of the photos that you saw in the gallery at the beginning were using those simulations. Most of the time now, I just use the film sims and I don't even edit before I share the photos. You can set it to fine JPEG and RAW so that you get both the Fuji sim and a RAW image that you can edit your own way, which honestly is a pretty cool feature. It's great if you're afraid of commitment. Also, I really can't tell you why, but my thumbnails aren't displaying properly in Lightroom, but it does work, I promise. But anyway, here's a quick rundown of all the film simulations. Unfortunately, this camera is a little too old to have classic negative, which was my favorite one from the X Pro 3. There is a hack out there to get all of them. I'm going to link the video in the description below, but full disclosure, haven't done it myself, so I'm not gonna, vouch for it. If you're in the playback menu, you can also mess around with a sort of digital darkroom. In the menu under raw conversion, you can push, pull, process, you can apply film simulations, you can add grain, and even change the white balance. It's pretty cool, honestly. Admittedly though, I don't mess with it too much, mainly because I just really love the film simulations. I don't really find a need to mess with them too much. Speaking of that, let's do a quick high ISO test. Very exciting. This is definitely subjective to the user. Some people like that grainier look. For me, ISO 6400 is kind of the furthest I would go. Anything above that starts to look a little yee. Here are some not so great things. The way the on-off switch works, I've had times where my X100F turned on in my camera bag or in my pocket because the little nubby thing got caught on something. That does suck for battery life, but it also sometimes throws some weird errors. For example, I've gotten focusing errors where it seems as though the lens is trying to focus infinitely, and in order to not burn itself out, it'll just kind of error out the camera and freeze it up and make some weird noises, and you have to pop the battery out for it to reset. Wish I could show you what that looks like, but I didn't encounter the error while I was making this video, and I didn't have the guts to try and force it to happen and destroy my camera. And yes, I do have a thumbs up and soft shutter release on my camera with the red accents. I think it's very nice. Thanks for noticing. Engage! Hipster mode! 'Cause you are water 12 feet deep! Speaking of the battery, by the way, which I'm not about to say the battery life is bad, because honestly it's pretty damn good if you're mainly doing photos. But the SD card resides in the compartment for the battery, and just personal preference, I really don't like that. While we're on the topic too, you can charge the camera via USB. There's also no weather sealing on the camera. Now, I have been out in the rain with this camera before without issue, but it still kind of makes me feel like, I don't want my camera to die. I've also had some weird issues with the sensor for the electronic and optical viewfinder. It's supposed to just detect when you bring it up to your eye, but I found that if there's just like a speck of dust on there, it bugs, and it's like, oh, I don't know, do you mean the LCD screen? Do you mean the eye? I don't know. So you gotta make sure that that thing is super clean for it to work right. But honestly, the issues that I've had with this camera pale in comparison to the joy it's brought me. This camera is so special to me. It's been my daily carry, and it's gonna continue to be that way. So in conclusion, I'd like to finally end by saying that the FujiFilm X100F is a good camera. Jokes aside though, I know the market for premium compact cameras is pretty niche. That said, the X100F is a wonderful choice. There are older models in the lineup that are cheaper, and there's a newer version that is not cheaper. But to me, the F is worth every penny I paid for it. It's a camera I have a ton of love for, and I'm sure if you gave it a shot, you'd like it too. It is a little expensive though. Anyway, we're gonna boot up the Owen Wilson rating machine, and I'm giving the Fujifilm X100F 9 Owen Wilson wows out of 10. It's a beauty. Wow. Anyway guys, before we get out of here, we gotta talk about the feature of the week. And this week's theme was share a photo that you didn't really edit. I thought, you know, the Fujifilm simulations and not editing. See, I'm trying to make the themes match the videos now. It's I'm glad it took me months to figure that one out. And this week, the feature is going to this side toward screen. This photo is just eerie to me. I love it. There's something uneasy about it, and I love the tones and I love the contrast. Beautiful work. Anyway guys, thank you so much for tuning into the video, and thank you so sincerely for 10,000 subscribers. That is fucking nuts. We are gonna celebrate that proper. You'll see. Coming soon. It's gonna be great. All right, guys. Social media stuff. You know what it is. Bye.
And will you tell all your friends to smash the subscribe button? Today was all they was thinking. Today was all they was thinking. Let's go.
That is the last time I'm gonna end a video with this. All right. Really, bye now.